The figure who would be etched into history as Alfred the Great first entered the world in the royal settlement of Wantage, located within the modern county of Berkshire, during a period of some scholarly contention in the late 840s. While the precise year of his birth remains a subject of academic debate, a consensus places the event somewhere between 847 and 849, with the latter half of this range often being favored by contemporary historians. His father was King Ethelwulf, whose name in Old English translates to noble wolf, a fitting title for a ruler who, in 839, had inherited the crown of Wessex, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that vied for dominance over 9th century England. The lineage of this royal house was not without its complexities. There is compelling evidence to suggest a Kentish origin for the family, making them, in a sense, outsiders to the very kingdom they ruled. Furthermore, the custom of direct primogeniture was not a long-standing tradition in Wessex. The practice of a son directly succeeding his father had only been solidified in the early part of the 8th century, a relatively recent political development that ultimately paved the way for Ethelwulf's ascension to power. Alfred's mother, Osburh, was a woman of noble standing in her own right, the daughter of Oslac, who held the distinguished position of Pincerna, or royal butler, within the Wessex court. Her own ancestry was notable, tracing back to the Jutes, a distinct Anglo-Saxon tribe that had been instrumental in establishing a political entity on the Isle of Wight. Later chroniclers would describe Osburh as profoundly religious and possessing a noble character, traits that may well have been passed down to her youngest son, influencing his own development to a significant degree. The political world Alfred was born into was itself in a state of flux, a direct consequence of the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Western Roman Empire centuries earlier. This fragmentation had given rise to a tapestry of successor states across Western Europe, ruled by various Germanic tribes, such as the Franks in Gaul and the Visigoths in Hispania. In Britain, this led to the emergence of numerous competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, including Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, and Wessex. For a time, the Kingdom of Mercia achieved a dominant position, establishing what became known as the Mercian supremacy in the late 8th century, extending its influence across central England. Yet, by the time of Alfred's birth, Mercia's power was waning, and the Kingdom of Wessex, covering the lands of Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, and Somerset, was on a clear path of ascendancy, making it the preeminent independent power in southern England and the stage upon which Alfred's destiny would unfold. Details regarding Alfred's physical appearance remain elusive to history, as no contemporary portraits have survived, and the coins minted during his reign offer no realistic likeness from which to draw conclusions. The written descriptions that do exist, penned by near contemporaries, are frustratingly uninformative, often resorting to generic praise of his handsomeness in comparison to other rulers of the era, without providing any of the specific details that would paint a true picture of the man. Whether these laudatory but vague accounts reflect reality is impossible to determine with any certainty. What is known, however, is the structure of his immediate family. Alfred was the youngest of 6 children, having 4 older brothers, Ethelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, and 1 sister. This position, as the youngest son, had profound implications for his path to the throne. His eldest brother, Ethelstan, would die before their father, but the remaining 3, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, would each have a turn as King of Wessex, their short reigns preceding Alfred's own, much longer and more transformative rule. Our knowledge of his early life is frustratingly limited by the general scarcity of sources from the early Middle Ages, a problem that plagues the study of all figures from this period. However, Alfred is a remarkable exception in that he is by far the best documented English monarch between the Roman withdrawal in the 5th century and the Norman conquest in the 11th. The most crucial contemporary account is the life of King Alfred, a biography written by a Welsh monk named Asser, who was a learned member of Alfred's own court in the 880s and 890s and knew the king personally. This proximity makes Asser's work an invaluable first-hand narrative, though it must be approached with caution due to the biographer's potential tendency to embellish his patron's achievements. Complementing this biography is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a comprehensive series of annals on English history, along with numerous surviving royal charters and, significantly, Alfred's own considerable body of writing on law, philosophy, and ecclesiastical matters. It is from Asser that we learn one of the most revealing details of Alfred's youth. He did not learn to read until the age of 12. While not atypical in an era of widespread illiteracy, it underscores the remarkable nature of his later transformation into a king celebrated as much for his scholarship as for his military victories. Another formative event was his pilgrimage to Rome around the age of 7 or 8, taken alongside his father, a journey that included a passage through the court of Charles the Bald, the powerful ruler of West Francia. More apocryphal is the tale of his mother challenging her sons to memorize a book of Anglo-Saxon poems, a story that, while of uncertain authenticity, serves as a powerful literary device to foreshadow his future intellectual prowess. Far more certain, however, was his lifelong struggle with a chronic and debilitating illness, which modern scholars generally agree was likely Crohn's disease, a condition that undoubtedly contributed to his premature death in his early 50s. While Alfred was coming of age, the political tectonic plates of England were shifting beneath his feet. The Kingdom of Wessex was not merely surviving, it was actively expanding its dominion and consolidating its power in the south. The final vestiges of an independent Cornwall were effectively subjugated by Wessex between the 830s and 850s, while the Kingdom of Kent was fully amalgamated into the larger West Saxon realm, creating a more unified and formidable southern power. However, this period of internal strengthening was shadowed by the emergence of a new and profoundly destructive force that had begun to make its presence felt from across the North Sea. The first Viking raid had struck the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, an event that heralded a new age of terror. For the first half of the 9th century, these incursions were intermittent and largely confined to coastal targets, with the Viking forces rarely establishing a lasting presence. Yet, just as Wessex was grappling with this external threat, it was also navigating significant internal tensions within its own royal family. In 856, upon returning from his continental pilgrimage, King Ethelwulf was confronted by an internal rebellion led by his own eldest son, Ethelbald, who sought to usurp the throne with the backing of powerful figures like the Ealdorman of Somerset and the Bishop of Sherborne. Unable to completely quash the challenge, Ethelwulf was forced into a compromise agreement that fractured the kingdom's leadership. Ethelbald became king of the traditional core of Wessex, while his father was effectively demoted to ruling over the subordinate eastern territories of Kent. This division persisted after Ethelwulf's death in 858, when his next son, Ethelbert, inherited the Kentish portion. The situation remained fluid, however, and when Ethelbald died childless just 2 years later in 860, Ethelbert seized the opportunity to reunite Wessex and Kent, restoring the kingdom to a single, centralized leadership. This precedent was followed when Ethelred succeeded his brother in 865, ensuring that by the time Alfred's turn came, he would inherit a unified realm rather than a divided one, even if it meant he lacked the prior experience of ruling a sub-kingdom as his brothers had. This unity would prove essential, because from 865 onwards, the nature of the Viking threat changed irrevocably. Large, organized forces, such as the one commanded by the Danish warlord Halfdan Ragnarsson, termed the Great Heathen Army, arrived not simply to raid, but to conquer and settle, fundamentally altering the balance of power in England forever. The speed and brutality of the Great Heathen Army's campaign were unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons had ever witnessed. The northern kingdom of Northumbria was effectively overrun in a span of just 2 to 3 years, between 865 and 867, and by the end of 870, East Anglia had also been absorbed into the rapidly expanding territory controlled by the Danes. Even the once mighty kingdom of Mercia lost a vast portion of its land and was left severely weakened. With the north and east of England largely under their control by 870, the strategic path was cleared for the Viking forces to pivot and begin striking southwards, directly into the heartlands of Wessex, the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom holding out against them. In late 870 and early 871, a series of intense raids were launched against the kingdom, but Wessex proved to be a far tougher opponent than the Danes had anticipated. The southern Anglo-Saxons were not so easily overmatched. Under the leadership of King Ethelred, they mounted a vigorous defense and even managed to repel several attacks, securing important victories that served as a crucial morale boost. These initial successes sent a clear message. The Danes were not invincible, and Wessex would not be conquered with the same devastating ease as Northumbria and East Anglia had been. It was at this critical juncture, just weeks after these fierce clashes, that the kingdom was plunged into a succession crisis. In 871, Ethelred's reign, like those of his elder brothers, proved to be tragically brief. He died of unknown causes, perhaps as young as 25, leaving behind 2 infant sons. In a time of peace, their claim might have been considered, but with the Danish armies actively moving south, the kingdom could not afford the instability of a regency. The crisis demanded a proven leader, a man of military age and capability. The decision made by the Witan, the Council of Leading Men, was both obvious and pragmatic. Alfred, the last surviving brother, would be king, as he was deemed the best and most capable choice to confront the existential emergency that Wessex now faced. The situation he inherited was immediately perilous and would only grow more so. In the spring of 871, as if to mark his coronation, a new Viking army arrived from Scandinavia, led by a formidable commander named Guthrum, who would soon establish himself as king of East Anglia and become Alfred's primary Danish adversary for the next 20 years. Clashes erupted almost immediately across southern England, with Alfred winning a significant early victory at the Battle of Edington, yet also suffering a series of demoralizing setbacks that allowed the Danes to make threatening forays deep into the Wessex heartlands of Wiltshire and Hampshire, demonstrating the precariousness of his new reign. The initial phase of Alfred's reign was a desperate struggle for survival, a trial by fire against a seemingly relentless foe. Despite the morale-boosting victory at Ashdown, a series of subsequent military setbacks meant that the Danish forces under the command of Guthrum were able to penetrate deep into the traditional heartlands of Wessex, threatening the very existence of the kingdom. It was in this dire context that a sudden and unexpected shift occurred. Guthrum and his army abruptly turned their attention elsewhere, moving away from Wessex. The reason for this strategic pivot seems to have been twofold. Firstly, there is little doubt among historians that Alfred and his advisors resorted to a pragmatic, if costly, solution. They agreed to pay a substantial tribute, a form of protection money known historically as a Dane geld or black tax, to persuade the invaders to cease their attacks. This was a common, if often temporary, tactic used by rulers facing Viking incursions across Europe. Secondly, Guthrum was also distracted by a tantalizing opportunity that had presented itself further north. While the kingdom of Mercia had been severely weakened, a portion of it had remained independent. In 872, Guthrum decided to turn west to fully conquer this rump state, a campaign that would occupy his forces for several years. This confluence of bribery and distraction granted Wessex a precious and desperately needed respite. Alfred, however, did not squander this invaluable breathing space by simply hoping for the best. Instead, he initiated a profound and systematic overhaul of his kingdom's military capabilities, determined to ensure Wessex would be better prepared for the inevitable return of the Viking threat. One of the central pillars of his reform was the radical reorganization of the fyrd, the traditional Anglo-Saxon militia composed of all the freemen of the kingdom who owed a certain period of military service to their king each year. Alfred's key innovation was to divide the entire fyrd into two rotating contingents. At any given time, one half would be on active military duty, serving in the field as a mobile army, while the other half would remain at home, tending to their farms and ensuring the kingdom's economy did not collapse. This created a sustainable system for long-term defense, allowing Alfred to keep a seasoned army in the field for extended campaigns without exhausting his manpower or food supply, a critical advantage against a mobile enemy. In a moment of supreme crisis, this system meant that theoretically half of Wessex's fighting-age population could be called upon to defend the realm, creating a defensive force of a scale his predecessors could only have dreamed of. Complementing the reform of the land army was the second major aspect of Alfred's military revolution, a focused effort to bolster the kingdom's naval power. While later historians, particularly during the age of British maritime dominance, would often lionize Alfred as the veritable father of the English Navy, the reality is more nuanced. He certainly patronized a significant naval buildup, commissioning the construction of ships built to a new and improved design. These vessels were notably larger than their predecessors, reputedly powered by 60 oars, making them faster and more formidable in coastal engagements. This innovative design proved effective and would become a staple of English naval forces for many years to come, marking Alfred as a true pioneer in naval architecture. However, it is crucial to temper this praise with historical context. The various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had maintained strong naval traditions for centuries. They were, after all, peoples who had originally arrived in Britain by sea. Therefore, it is more accurate to conclude that Alfred did not create a navy where none had existed before, but rather he professionally upgraded, expanded, and standardized an existing naval capability, adapting it specifically to counter the Viking longships. The third and arguably most transformative element of his military reforms, however, lay in the field of fortification. Over the course of his reign, Alfred initiated a massive and systematic program to construct a chain of fortified settlements, known as burhs, throughout the Kingdom of Wessex. Some of these were built entirely from scratch, while others ingeniously repurposed the defensive. Remains of older Roman forts, or Iron Age hill forts. Their strategic placement was key. A burh was constructed to be within approximately 20 miles, or a day's march, of every significant settlement in Wessex, creating a dense defensive network that was particularly concentrated in vulnerable coastal regions. These were not mere military outposts, but were designed as centers of refuge where the local population could flee for safety during a raid. To maintain this extensive network, an extraordinarily sophisticated system of administration was devised. Each burh was allotted a specific number of hides, a unit of land measurement, from the surrounding region. This allocation was then used to calculate the number of men the local populace was obligated to provide for the fort's initial construction, its ongoing maintenance, and, most importantly, its permanent garrison. We are incredibly fortunate that a document known as the Burghal Hidage survives, which meticulously details this very system. Though the extant copy likely dates to the 920s, it is clearly based on an earlier version from Alfred's time, and it reveals that the system allowed for the theoretical mobilization of over 27,000 men across Wessex, a staggering figure that ensured the burh system would become the unbreachable backbone of the kingdom's defense for generations. Speaking of building a formidable defense with the support of the community, we also have a very important building goal here on the channel. We want to reach the milestone of 1,000 subscribers by July 30th. If you're enjoying how we're building this story, please consider subscribing to help us strengthen our own wall of knowledge. Your subscription is essential for us to continue. While Alfred's far-reaching military innovations were being set in motion, Their full benefits had yet to be realized by the late 870s. The kingdom's defensive network was still in its infancy, a fact that would soon be brutally exploited. By the year 874, the Danish commander Guthrum had successfully completed his conquest of Mercia, installing a puppet ruler named Ceolwulf to govern the region on his behalf. With this strategic buffer zone in western England now pacified and under his control, Guthrum was free to turn his undivided attention back towards the south, to the Kingdom of Wessex, which stood as the last major bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance in England. In 876, operating from a base of operations in the Cambridge region, he unleashed a new wave of attacks, initially focusing his efforts on the city of Exeter in the western reaches of Wessex. The months that followed were characterized by a grinding and uncertain war of attrition, a relentless cycle of fierce clashes, hostage exchanges, ransom payments, and ambiguous offers of peace that were made only to be broken. It was during this tense period that Alfred would experience the closest and most devastating call of his entire reign. On the 6th of January 878, during the Christian festivities of Twelfth Night, Guthrum executed a brilliant and ruthless surprise attack on the royal court, which was then residing at the settlement of Chippenham in Wiltshire. The timing was deliberately chosen to maximize shock and disarray. Taken completely unawares, the Wessex court was overwhelmed with terrifying speed. Alfred himself only managed to escape the ensuing slaughter by the narrowest of margins, forced to abandon his throne and become a desperate fugitive in his own kingdom. For several harrowing weeks, accompanied by only a small, loyal band of followers, he found refuge in the remote, inaccessible, and waterlogged marshes of the Somerset levels. From this hidden sanctuary, surrounded by treacherous terrain, he began the near-impossible task of regrouping his shattered forces and formulating a plan for retaliation. In the meantime, during the bleak spring of 878, with the king in hiding and the kingdom's leadership scattered, Guthrum and his Danish army had free rein to pillage and terrorize Wessex at will, bringing the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom to the very brink of total annihilation. The Danish dominion over Wessex during the spring of 878, however absolute it may have seemed, was not destined to last. Hidden away in the Somerset marshes, Alfred was not merely surviving, he was planning. As the spring progressed, he masterfully coordinated with his remaining loyal Thanes and Ealdormen, sending out messengers to orchestrate a great mustering of the Fyrd. Soon, he emerged from the wetlands, no longer a fugitive, but a king ready to reclaim his realm, and was soon in the field, actively seeking to hunt down Guthrum and bring him to battle. This daring campaign of retaliation would culminate in the single most significant military engagement of Alfred's life, the Battle of Edington. This decisive confrontation is generally understood by historians to have taken place between the 6th and 8th of May, 878, near the modern-day village of Edington in Wiltshire. Unfortunately, as is common for the period, contemporary accounts of the engagement are frustratingly sparse on precise tactical details. However, a careful analysis of the strategic situation allows for a plausible reconstruction. It seems highly likely that Alfred's forces held a considerable numerical advantage over Guthrum's. By the late 870s, the Danish armies in England were becoming increasingly fractured by internal rivalries, and it is probable that Guthrum's raiding force received little to no support from other Danish contingents further north. In stark contrast, Alfred's call to arms had been met with a powerful response. On his march towards Edington, he had summoned a great levy from the shires of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, men who were weary of the Danish occupation and eager for retribution. As a consequence, he likely arrived at the battlefield with a substantial numerical superiority. Of the battle itself, the chronicler Asser provides one crucial detail. Alfred commanded his Anglo-Saxon warriors to form a dense and overlapping shield wall, a formidable tactic of the era, and in this tight formation, they advanced to meet the entire force of the Danes. The ensuing fight was brutal and bloody, a grinding melee that raged for hours until the Danish line finally broke under the relentless pressure. The army of Wessex then pursued the fleeing invaders all the way back to their main fortress at Chippenham, the very site of Alfred's earlier humiliation. There, a siege ensued for 2 long weeks, until the Danes, starving and completely cut off from resources, were finally forced to sue for peace, sealing one of the most remarkable military comebacks in English history. The resounding victory at Edington was not merely an end to a campaign. It was the crucial prelude to the negotiation of the most significant and durable peace terms agreed upon between Alfred and any Viking leader during his entire reign. The resulting agreement, which has come to be known as the Treaty of Wedmore, was in every sense a capitulation by Guthrum and his forces. The terms were stringent and deeply symbolic. In a powerful demonstration of Alfred's authority, Guthrum and 30 of his most senior followers were compelled to accept baptism and convert to Christianity, with Alfred himself standing as Guthrum's godfather in the ceremony. This act was more than a religious formality. It was a political submission intended to bind the Danish leader to a Christian code of conduct and integrate him, at least nominally, into the Anglo-Saxon political world. Beyond this, the treaty stipulated that the Danes were to withdraw completely from the lands of the Kingdom of Wessex and relocate their forces back into the region beyond its northern frontier, effectively confining them to East Anglia. While arrangements involving conversions and territorial withdrawals had been made before between Anglo-Saxons and Danes, they had often proved to be little more than temporary ceasefires. The Treaty of Wedmore, however, proved to be a far more substantial and long-lasting peace agreement. Although he took his time in doing so, Guthrum did eventually lead his followers into East Anglia and, for the most part, honored the treaty's terms for the remainder of his life. The enduring significance of this moment is underscored by the fact that, decades later, subsequent English kings were still symbolically commemorating the anniversary of the Battle of Edington, a clear indicator of the immense importance that contemporaries and their successors ascribed to the victory and the peace it secured. Most crucially, it firmly shattered the aura of Viking invincibility and established throughout England the powerful idea that the Kingdom of Wessex would not capitulate as its counterparts in Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia had done. The treaty formally fixed the boundary between Alfred's domain and Guthrum's along the course of the River Thames, extending westwards towards Bedford, thereby creating the formal frontier of what became known as the Danelaw, the portion of England where Danish law and custom would now hold sway. One of the most significant territorial gains for Alfred under the terms of the Treaty of Wedmore was his acquisition of London. At this stage in the 9th century, the city was not yet the singular preeminent metropolis of England that it would subsequently become. The old Roman city of Londinium, which may have boasted a population of up to 60,000 people at the height of the Roman presence, had fallen into dereliction and was almost entirely abandoned in the 5th century following the Roman withdrawal from Britain. While the exact timeline of its re-inhabitation is unclear, by the early 8th century, the great Anglo-Saxon scholar Bede described it as a noteworthy trading center for merchants from overseas. It had grown in importance under Mercian rule, housing significant mints for coinage and other important civic buildings. However, the intense wars of the mid-9th century had severely disrupted its life and damaged its infrastructure, leaving the city in a state of disrepair by the time it passed into Alfred's hands. Recognizing its strategic and economic potential, Alfred took immediate steps to revitalize it in the 880s. He ordered extensive repairs to be carried out on the old Roman defensive walls and had the city's surrounding ditch recut, actions which effectively set the physical boundaries of the City of London for several centuries to come. This program of restoration marked the beginning of a process whereby London started to occupy an ever greater space in England's urban, political, and economic landscape. With the defeat of Guthrum and the establishment of a relatively secure peace, Alfred was, for the first time in his reign, free to turn his attention to matters of governance without the constant existential threat of imminent invasion looming over him. This period allowed him to focus on his own family and dynasty. He had already become a married man in 868, 3 years prior to his accession to the throne, when he was joined with Ealhswith, the daughter of a prominent Mercian nobleman named Ethelred Mucul. Together they would have 5 children that are known to history. Their daughters were Ethelfled, Ethelgifu, and Elfthrith, amongst whom Ethelfled was perhaps the most prominent, as she would later marry into the Mercian royal family and emerge as the formidable Lady of the Mercians after her husband's death. Of their 2 sons, Edward and Ethelweard, it was Edward who would eventually succeed his father as king, ruling for a quarter of a century as a highly significant and successful monarch in his own right, continuing Alfred's work of consolidating the English kingdom. Following the establishment of a hard-won peace, a multitude of governmental matters began to occupy Alfred's attention during the 880s and 890s. He and his circle of advisors were profoundly aware that military strength was intrinsically linked to economic stability. A secure financial footing was not merely a matter of royal wealth, but a critical prerequisite for funding the sophisticated defensive network that would prevent future Viking incursions from succeeding. The enduring importance of this principle is precisely why we have such a detailed understanding of the burg system of fortifications. The famous Burgel Heidage document, while a record of a military system, is at its core an administrative and financial account. It is a meticulous ledger detailing exactly how this immense public works project was financed, laying out a systematic method of taxation whereby payments were collected from specific allotments of land, or hides, throughout the entirety of Wessex to fund the construction and maintenance of the forts. This document stands as a powerful testament to the formalization of the kingdom's finances, and a vast improvement in the systems by which taxes were collected and administered under Alfred's rule. Further evidence of this burgeoning economic success can be found in the details of Alfred's own will. Upon his death, a staggering 2,000 pounds of silver were distributed according to his final wishes. A colossal sum for the period, which speaks volumes about the affluence of the kingdom and suggests that the nascent state's reserves of coin were at a higher level in the latter part of his reign than they had been at almost any previous point in its history. Scholars have pointed to several factors that may explain this sudden and dramatic boom in the Wessex exchequer, beyond simple administrative reorganization. It has been plausibly suggested that Alfred took a keen and active interest in developing the traditional tin and silver mining industries of southern England, which would have brought significant new revenues into the royal coffers. Likewise, the strategic expansion of the kingdom itself, most notably the incorporation of the major commercial and minting center of London into Wessex, would have naturally generated substantial additional income. It is even possible that increasing trade along the southern coast of England, perhaps even with the Viking settlers to the north, brought in new revenue through tariffs and duties. Perhaps most striking of all, however, is the evidence that the E-as tables had turned so completely that Alfred was now capable of extracting his own payments and bribes from the Danes in the north to ensure he would stay out of their affairs, a stunning reversal of the Danegeld payments that had crippled his kingdom in the first years of his reign. The most tangible and striking evidence of Wessex's dramatic financial recovery can be seen impressed in the very metal of the coins issued during Alfred's reign. At the height of the existential crisis of the 870s, the silver pennies being minted in Wessex were heavily debased, their silver content drastically lowered as the kingdom's resources were stretched to their absolute limit. This development mirrors an interesting and consistent pattern seen elsewhere in 9th century Europe. Whenever a region came under persistent and intense attack from Viking forces, the precious metal content of its coinage would inevitably drop as the native rulers desperately tried to find any means necessary to hire more soldiers and fund a desperate defense. Yet, this debased crisis-era coinage in Wessex quickly gave way in the 880s to a new proper coinage with a high silver content, reverting to the standards seen before the great Viking invasions began. Indeed, the silver penny that was circulating in southern England during the second half of Alfred's reign possessed one of the highest and purest silver contents seen in the country throughout the entire early Middle Ages, a remarkable physical testament to the profound shift in the political and economic fortunes of the kingdom under his leadership. Beyond the battlefield and the treasury, an often overlooked but hugely significant aspect of Alfred's achievement was his role as a substantial early English lawmaker. We are fortunate that a copy of his extensive law book, or Dambach, survives, which he likely issued in the late 880s or early 890s. On the surface, his approach to jurisprudence was quite traditionalist. Much of his law code was consciously based on an older Wessex code instituted by the early 8th century king, Ine, and Alfred even appended a copy of Ine's laws to his own text to demonstrate this continuity. He further grounded his authority by invoking the Mosaic laws of the Old Testament and the directives of the early papacy, framing his approach as one that was deeply respectful of both divine and temporal precedent. Yet within this traditional framework, Alfred introduced a profound innovation. The most significant change was contained in an opening clause that discussed the sacred importance of keeping an oath and a pledge. Within this section, the very notion of what constituted loyalty to the ruler was being redefined and strengthened. Throughout the code, loyalty to the king became inextricably associated with obedience to God and the established laws of the past. As a result, harsh and specific penalties could now be imposed for disobeying the ruling power, laying the conceptual groundwork for what would evolve into the crimes of felony and treason, a cornerstone of royal power in the English legal system for a millennium to come. Given the extraordinary breadth of documentary evidence that illuminates so many aspects of Alfred's reign, from his military revolution and financial reforms to his legal innovations and patronage of London, there exists a considerable and somewhat perplexing blind spot in the historical record. For an era so otherwise well documented, we know surprisingly little about how the institutional church fared during the nearly 30 years that he ruled, between 871 and 899. It is entirely safe to assume that the wealth, fabric, and morale of the church in southern England had been extensively and systematically compromised by the decades of Viking invasions. Monasteries and churches, often located in isolated areas and known to hold precious metalwork and other treasures, were the prime targets for raiders, and the wars that followed had undoubtedly led to widespread destruction and institutional decay. It is strange, then, that the surviving records do not speak of Alfred, a famously pious and devout Christian king, making any kind of large-scale concerted effort to reform or rebuild these ecclesiastical institutions during his time on the throne. The kind of sweeping, systematic reconstruction that he applied to the military and the law seems to be absent when it comes to the church. This is not to say there was a complete lack of activity, and there are some important glimmers of evidence for his patronage. Most notably, Alfred founded 2 new monasteries, one at Athelney, near the site of his refuge in the marshes, and a nunnery at Shaftesbury. The establishment of these institutions is highly significant, as they were the very first new monastic houses to be founded in southern England in over 100 years. However, the limited scale of this activity suggests a certain reticence. This may have been due to a pragmatic and calculated fear about the resumption of full-scale war with the Scandinavians. Alfred may have reasoned that newly rebuilt and re-endowed churches and monasteries in the south of England would simply prove to be irresistible and vulnerable targets for the Danes of East Anglia or for new Viking armies arriving from overseas, should they once again go to war with Wessex. Therefore, his relative inaction may not have been a sign of neglect, but rather one of strategic patience and prudence in an age of persistent, if diminished, threat. The decisive victory at Edington in 878 and the subsequent Treaty of Wedmore did not in fact bring a permanent conclusion to the conflict between Wessex and the Danes. Throughout the 880s and 890s, intermittent conflict continued to flare up along the frontier, though these later clashes never posed the same kind of existential threat to Wessex's future that had been so terrifyingly present in the 870s. The strategic balance of power had fundamentally shifted in Alfred's favor. One particularly large outburst of violence occurred from the year 892, when a major new Danish force attempted a large-scale invasion. By this time, however, Alfred's comprehensive military reforms, and particularly the deeply entrenched and fully garrisoned Boer system, had taken such a profound effect that the Danes found it immensely more difficult to penetrate southwards into the heart of Wessex. The campaign devolved into a series of engagements, fought primarily around the Thames area, on the border between Alfred's domains and the Danelaw, with the invaders effectively contained at the frontier. The outcome of this large initiative of the early 890s, which produced little tangible result for the Danes involved, stands in striking contrast to the lightning-fast conquests achieved by Halfdan Ragnarsson in the late 860s and Guthrum in the 870s. The successful defense of the kingdom was the ultimate proof of concept for Alfred's new model, army and fortifications. Thereafter, Viking forces operating in the wider North Sea region began to increasingly turn their attentions elsewhere, often towards the northern regions of France, where they were successfully carving out a large new principality in the area that would come to be known as Normandy. With the threat posed by the Danes now significantly reduced, though never entirely vanquished, Alfred was finally able, from the mid-880s onwards, to dedicate his time and resources to what was arguably his greatest and most overriding personal passion, the development of a vibrant, learned court at Winchester, the capital of Wessex. He envisaged himself presiding over such a court as a latter-day, wise King Solomon, a philosopher king who would guide his people not just with the sword, but with wisdom and scholarship, ushering in a new age of learning for his kingdom. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Alfred the Man, as distinct from Alfred the King, was the sheer breadth and depth of his own personal learning and scholarly output. With the immediate threat of war having subsided, he threw himself into a passionate project of intellectual revival, and the extent of his own extant works is truly considerable. His writings include his comprehensive law book, but more impressively, a series of thoughtful translations of some of the most important Latin texts of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Among these are Pope Gregory the Great's influential manual on the duties of a bishop, the Book of Pastoral Rule, the 5th century Roman philosopher Boethius's canonical work on fate and divine providence, the Consolation of Philosophy, and the Church Father Augustine of Hippo's introspective dialogue, the Soliloquies. He also undertook a translation and commentary on the first 50 Psalms from the Old Testament. These texts are almost unique for the entire early medieval period, as they offer a direct and intimate window into the worldview, moral, philosophy, and inner thoughts of a reigning European monarch. While the cultural movement he inspired, often termed the Alfredian Renaissance, cannot be said to compare in scale with the great Carolingian Renaissance patronized by Charlemagne in Western Europe a century earlier, there is simply no comparison between the two monarchs who oversaw them. Charlemagne, for all his immense power and patronage of others' learning, remained illiterate throughout his life, unable to either read or write. Alfred, in stunning contrast, not only read voraciously, but also personally translated and annotated these complex works, leaving behind a substantial corpus that is a testament to his own powerful intellect. Even if his political and military career had not been as monumentally significant as it was, he would still be a figure worthy of dedicated historical study for his scholarly output alone. The exact timeline for the composition of these works remains unclear, although it has been observed that his biographer Asser, writing around the year 893, makes little mention of them. This has led many scholars to conclude that this incredible literary output was likely the product of a particularly fertile and intense period of scholarship concentrated in the final years of his life, a last great project undertaken once the kingdom was secure. The texts that Alfred chose to translate and disseminate reveal an individual who was concerned not only with knowledge for its own sake, but with its practical application in the art of good kingship. He clearly conceived of himself as a latter-day King Solomon, a wise and just ruler whose duty it was to guide his people towards both spiritual and temporal prosperity. This deeply held belief explains his pronouncements in some of his writings that the people of Britain had previously prospered when learning flourished amongst their leaders and had suffered when knowledge was neglected. His choice to study and translate the works of Pope Gregory I is particularly significant in this regard. Gregory, who served as the Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604 and was later sanctified as Saint Gregory the Great, is widely understood to have been the most important of the early popes, not least because of his pivotal role in initiating the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity by sending missionaries to England. By immersing himself in Gregory's writings, Alfred was effectively seeking to understand the intellectual and spiritual framework of the very individual who had paved the way for the religious unification of Britain. To put this vision into practice, Alfred went beyond his own writing and established a vibrant school at the royal court in Winchester. This had a dual purpose. Firstly, to provide a high-quality education for his own children, and secondly, to begin inculcating a better standard of scholarship at the very heart of his government, creating a new generation of literate nobles and administrators. To this end, he embarked on an ambitious recruitment program, inviting famed scholars from across Britain and continental Europe to join his court. These included his future biographer Asser, a learned Welsh monk, Plegmund, a respected Mercian hermit, whom Alfred would appoint as Archbishop of Canterbury in 890, Grimbald of Saint-Bertin, a Benedictine monk from Francia, likely invited for his knowledge of Frankish government, and perhaps the most revered of all, John the Old. Saxon, a German scholar who was appointed abbot of Alfred's new monastery at Athelney. The rudimentary education system he fostered, modeled on Charlemagne's earlier efforts, was incredibly progressive for its time, seemingly including the children of families of lesser birth alongside those of the noble dynasties. Critically, Alfred also championed study in the vernacular, arguing that while Latin was the exalted language of the Church, it was essential for wisdom to be accessible in Old English, the language of the people. It is difficult to assess with certainty how successful Alfred's ambitious educational initiatives ultimately were. His overarching goal, in creating a court of scholars and a school for the young nobility at Winchester, was surely to cultivate a new class of learned and literate governors and administrators who would be better equipped to run the kingdom of Wessex efficiently and justly in the generations to come. Perhaps he was successful in this aim, but it is not wholly clear from the historical record. The surviving sources for the 10th century are so thin that it is difficult to determine the long-term extent of his success in this specific regard. Yet, even if the direct results of his educational program remain ambiguous, his patronage of scholarship and his determined attempts to create a learned society at Winchester must be judged on their own merits as admirable and profoundly visionary acts in their own right. However, as profoundly important a figure as Alfred was from a literary and scholarly perspective, and as monumentally significant as his reign was in securing the very survival of Wessex against Danish conquest, he is best known to history for a different and even grander achievement, laying the foundations of the English nation. Over the course of his reign, he had systematically expanded Wessex's sphere of control, moving northwards to gain direct authority over London and much of the kingdom of Mercia. While a rump Mercian state was allowed a nominal independence after the Treaty of Wedmore, it was increasingly an English protectorate. Furthermore, Alfred forged strategic alliances with many of the rulers of Wales, creating a broad coalition of peoples who stood in opposition to the Danelaw. By the 880s, Alfred could plausibly lay claim to directly ruling over all of southern England, holding nominal control over much of the country's central heartlands and enjoying suzerainty further west. This, forging of a political and cultural union between the various Anglo-Saxon peoples who were not under the direct control of the Danes, is highly significant. Contemporaries were fully aware of the importance of this shift. It is unsurprising, then, to find that in official charters from the late 880s, Alfred is increasingly referred to not just as King of Wessex, but as King of the Anglo-Saxons, a title that clearly indicates he was now seen as acting on behalf of all English people outside of Danish control. When Alfred eventually died, he did not rule over England in the modern, fully unified sense of the word, but he had undeniably laid down the conceptual and political groundwork for a centralized state on the island of Britain that would, in time, unite the disparate Anglo-Saxon peoples under a single monarch. Alfred the Great died on the 26th of October, 899, when he was still just in his early 50s. While the exact cause of his death is unknown, it is highly plausible that it was associated with the chronic poor health, now widely believed to have been Crohn's disease, that had plagued him for his entire life. He was buried in the Old Minster in Winchester, in what would become the family crypt for the royal house of Wessex. Sadly, for an individual who would come to be revered as the father of the English nation, the fate of his physical remains was to be a long and wholly ignominious one. His resting place was disturbed on several occasions by future English monarchs. In the early 12th century, his remains were exhumed and moved to the newly constructed Hyde Abbey nearby. Then, during the reign of Henry VIII in the 16th century, Hyde Abbey was dissolved as part of the Reformation and subsequently demolished, leading to Alfred's grave and those of his family members being effectively lost and forgotten about at the site. There they lay, buried in an anonymous field, for 2.5 centuries before being accidentally unearthed during the construction of a local prison in the late 18th century. In a final tragic indignity, the ancient coffins were broken apart and destroyed, and the bones within, including those of the great king himself, were unceremoniously scattered and lost to history forever. In stark contrast to the sad fate of his body, the kingdom Alfred left behind was far more fortunate and enduring. He was succeeded by his son, Edward, who, in the course of his own impressive 25-year reign, was able to successfully conquer East Anglia from the Danes, methodically continuing his father's work of reconquest. The task was ultimately completed by Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan. It was Ethelstan who was able to complete the destruction of the remaining Viking kingdoms in the north, formally uniting England as a single political entity when he amalgamated Northumbria into his expanded kingdom in the late 920s. Ethelstan was, for all intents and purposes, the first Anglo-Saxon king to rule over all of England, a consolidation of power so complete that he was able to launch a major invasion of Scotland in the 930s, marking the true arrival of the powerful, unified English state for which his grandfather had laid the essential foundation. There can be no doubting Alfred's immense and multifaceted contribution to the course of English history and the development of the English state. His first and most urgent task upon becoming King of Wessex in the 870s was to achieve what the other English kings had failed to do, to finally halt the devastating Viking incursions that had already shattered the kingdoms of Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. This he successfully accomplished within a few short years, in part by instigating a military revolution that fundamentally reorganized the way land forces were utilized in Wessex, while he also reformed the kingdom's navy to better challenge the Danes at sea. As a result, he was ultimately victorious at the pivotal Battle of Edington in 878, stopping the southward advance of the Danes in its tracks. While this victory did not bring a complete end to Viking raids, and further attacks would occur with regularity throughout the 880s and 890s, the existential threat to Wessex's very survival had been effectively neutralized. The sophisticated system of burhs, or fortifications, which he established across the landscape of southern England, provided a new and lasting sense of safety and security for his subjects in the years that followed. Yet, away from the battlefield, Alfred was an even more accomplished and complex monarch. He comprehensively reformed the finances of the kingdom, began the development of London in a way that would set it on its path to becoming the preeminent city of England, and rejuvenated the nation's cultural life through his patronage of the church and education in the aftermath of the Viking ravages. More strikingly still, he was a highly accomplished and profound scholar in his own right, personally, producing works on towering intellectual figures, such as the late Roman philosopher Boethius and the influential early bishop of Rome, Pope Gregory the Great. By all accounts, he appears to have been a model king. He did not wage unnecessary wars for personal aggrandizement, nor were there records of large internal political disputes that resulted in the king shedding blood to maintain his authority. We have presented a complete portrait of Alfred, with his struggles and glories. But history is a dialogue. For you, what was the greatest of all his achievements? Was it the military victory, the educational reform, or the creation of the laws? Leave your comment below. Your feedback is the most important tool we have to evaluate and improve our work, and we would love to know what impacted you the most in this video. The epithet of great is not bestowed lightly, but in the case of Alfred, it feels not merely deserved but essential. His life serves as a powerful testament to the idea that true greatness is not an inheritance, but is instead forged in the crucible of profound adversity. He began as an unlikely candidate for the throne, the youngest son, never expected to rule, and afflicted from a young age with a debilitating chronic illness that would cause him pain for his entire life. He did not inherit a kingdom at peace, but was thrust into power at its moment of gravest peril, tasked with fighting a seemingly hopeless war against an unstoppable foe. His journey took him to the absolute depths of failure, to the point where he was a hunted fugitive in his own land, hiding with a handful of followers in the desolate marshes of Somerset. Yet it was in that moment of utter defeat, stripped of all the trappings of power, that his resilience was truly tempered. His response to this crisis defines his legacy. He did not merely seek revenge, he sought to rebuild. He demonstrated an incredible capacity for personal and intellectual growth, transforming himself from a cornered warrior into a visionary architect of a New England. His refusal to be broken became the spirit of his kingdom's defense. The military, legal, and financial reforms he instituted were the actions of a leader who was not just thinking about the next battle, but about the next century. The system of burrs was more than a defense strategy. It was a declaration of permanence. His educational program and his championing of the English language were more than a scholarly pastime. They were acts of profound nation-building, giving his people a shared culture and identity worth defending. He not only managed to defend the last remnant of Anglo-Saxon England from being extinguished, but, by the end of his life, had established the political and cultural foundations of the unified English state that would endure, in one form or another, right down to the present day, leaving an inspirational legacy of how leadership, wisdom, and an unbreakable will can turn the tide of history.